Good evening and welcome to tonight's program with author Rae Katherine Eighmey as we explore the storytelling power of a good recipe. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. And tonight's interview is going to be conducted by our foundation president and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us. We are closing in on the final few webinars before the holidays. Can't quite believe I'm saying that, but we are. But we have really enjoyed bringing the webinar series to you in your homes this fall and look forward to continuing to celebrate other amazing authors, historians, and historical interpreters in the months to come. Following tonight's presentation, we will entertain questions from the audience. So please type your questions in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as possible. And now I would like to welcome Erin Mast, who will make the introduction of tonight's guest and get this program started. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for another installment of our Fourscore speaker series. We are delighted to be joined by Rae Katherine Eighmey. Rae Eighmey loves the storytelling power of great recipes. In the years since she began cooking using handwritten cards discovered in the century-old family wooden file box, she has learned how to make old recipes work in modern kitchens. She says that the process involves a lot of research and dirty dishes, but the rewards are incomparably delicious and informative. It often begins with questions. How do the ingredients reflect life and times? What can we learn about the history of the region or the nation? And importantly, what do the dishes tell us about the people who cooked and ate them? A dedicated Midwesterner, Rae Eighmey is a graduate of the University of Iowa. However, she has had the advantage of living in mid-Atlantic states where she worked in advertising and public relations and was surrounded by colonial history. Later, she and her family lived in Alabama, where she worked with the Tuscaloosa Historic Preservation Commission. She published her first historically focused cookbook as an outgrowth of her lifestyle research there. For the Minnesota Historical Society Press, she has written award-nominated books on World War I food conservation, prohibition, and 1950s era community cookbooks. Eighmey has won awards for her writing, but the ribbons she has won at both the Iowa and Minnesota State Fair food contests are particularly satisfying. Eighmey came to her love of Abraham Lincoln as a child touring Springfield and New Salem. Then in 2006, her husband John asked the fateful question, "What do you think Abraham Lincoln enjoyed eating?" As the Thanksgiving turkey baked, she turned to their collection of Lincoln books and began to find the answers. Abraham Lincoln in the Kitchen was published by Smithsonian Books in 2013. Her most recent book, also published by Smithsonian, is Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin. Rae, thank you for joining us. It is so good to see you again. My first question is how you came to research and write about foodways. Your bio suggests a family artifact, that old recipe box played a strong role. Is that it? And how did that develop from personal passion to professional research and writing?
Thank you, Erin. It's a delight to see you again and delight to be here talking to all of the folks that are there. And you're absolutely right. It was that box that I just, opened. It turns out that it was a shower gift to one of my family members. And so she has had all the recipes from her best friend and her future mother-in-law. And I started looking at them and, they were pretty well organized and pretty well written, but need a little tinkering with it. So I started cooking and started tasting foods that were similar to what I had grown up with and what I cook now, but they just had a little extra something, a nuance of texture, a slightly different taste, dates, a lot of dates, and lard, which is actually a pretty healthy fat. But then when we moved to Tuscaloosa, where I was, let's face it, a Yankee, I never earned my hoop skirt, but I tried. I worked at the restoration of the Jemison Vandegraff Mansion, which is really a remarkable antebellum home. And I wanted to tell the story of the family that lived there. One family owned it from 1858 through the 1930s. And I wanted to begin to touch base with, beyond the usual antebellum stories. So fortunately, the household notebook of Mrs. Robert Jemison, the man who built the mansion, was in the University of Alabama Special Collections. And there were 2 recipes in there, and they required serious decoding.
Yeah.
She wrote them down in this, you could almost feel the arthritis that must have been in her hands because of the pencil writing and the large loopy letters. One of them was for Sally Lunn, which is a pretty common cake, and I was able to figure out what she was doing. The other was for a thing called jumbles. Well, didn't know what a jumble was. Fortunately, the University of Alabama never threw a book away. So, and their stacks are largely open. So I just started working backwards through the stacks, looking at all the indexes of all these cookbooks for jumbles, and working back and found one that was about the right era. And it's a really nice sugar cookie tea cake kind of thing that is in the shape of a donut. You roll the dough and like a snake and connect the ends and flatten it and dip it in sugar and bake it. And it's a nice, mild, not too sweet cookie. And I had one of the best compliments I have ever had in my life for cooking when one of the historians who worked at the house, I brought some and he tasted them and he said, "These taste just like my grandma's tea cakes." And I thought, I got it. Yes, 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 I got it. So, as I had been going through all those cookbooks looking for the jumbles, I bumped into more and more different recipes. And well, that would be good. That one looks tasty. So I copied them down. And then John, my husband, would come home for dinner and I'd say, "Okay, we have 1859, 1862, the vegetables are 1883. And so we had these dishes from, across the centuries. And so one thing led to another. And I just started keeping, good notes about what I was doing and beginning to develop a logic for how you interpret both recipes that are in cookbooks where all you have is what they used to call the rule for a recipe, which is just the amounts of things. No methodology, because you knew the method. Everyone cooked, everyone knew the method. So you just had what the specific ingredients were, and the measurements were not always what one would like. Teacup, coffee cup are 2 different measures. Butter the size of an egg, a walnut piece of lard. You sort of get the sense of where you need to interpret. So I began to being pretty systematic about developing a way to work with them as I discovered all these really wonderful flavors and textures, and one thing led to another. And I had a little cookbook published by Howell Press, which was out of North Carolina at the time. But the kind of the most fun was we would have fundraising events at the Jemison. So I would make everything to fill this huge table with, treats, and people would come and we would encourage them to learn about the mansion and help us, continue our efforts. But I did always get a bit of a secret chuckle. There was a recipe I discovered in the Dixie cookbook for a cake, which is called Southern Rights cake.
Oh.
As in, give me my rights.
Oh dear.
Well, and they also had a Tilden cake, which if you know your history of that era, he was a Southern leaning person. But I would do my Southern Rights cake and I would put my Lincoln cake right next to it. I couldn't help myself.
Well, and Rae, when we first met, it was when you were working on your book, Abraham
Yes.
Lincoln in the Kitchen. And I was with President Lincoln's Cottage at the time. And I remember us sitting down and talking about the research and what the research said about Lincoln's personal eating habits when he was president during the Civil War. And that included, such a range of what he ate when he was maybe alone or with soldiers, and then also what he was eating at celebrations, and just his relationship with food. What did you learn about Lincoln's food habits and preferences, and what does that evidence reveal about him to you?
That's a really great question, Erin, and it's kind of the foundation of the whole book. You know, the book goes from his childhood through the presidency. And he, you know, as you suggested, he ate widely. You know, I think it's a tendency for me and for a lot of us, but for me particularly, when I first started thinking about this work and researching his life, that when you think, well, you know, the poor kid, he's, you know, lumping around in Indiana on a backwards farm. And if you go to the site of the Indiana farm right now, it's pretty much out in the woods. You know, the national park is there, but it's surrounded by forests in the area where Mr. Gentry's store is, you know, on an overgrown lot. But when you delve into it, you see, well, it was a community, there were 59 children, you know, within several blocks, although they weren't blocks, you know, several farmsteads around. And then when you read what Herndon researched from the people who lived there, they had tremendous diverse fruit and vegetables and proteins right there. So, you know, he's eating, we could consider it rustic, but it's also incredibly varied. You know, you've got things like, you know, pawpaws and the stuff that they grow on the farm. So it's not all cornmeal, although Lincoln loved corn cakes his whole life. And there are, you know, several ways to make them, all of them good. But then as he moves into being successful, the other thing that I discovered was pretty early on, he cooks. When he and his cousin and stepbrother went down to New Orleans and Lincoln was 22, he, you know, they say, you know, in their explanation of the trip, I think it was Hanks that said it, was that we elected Abe cook because it took them a month to build the flatboat. So, you know, he's cooking there. He's kind of tinkering around with food a little bit, I think, in New Salem. Although I think, I mean, there was the inn where he could have eaten, you know, but the stunning revelation was, you know, a sentence I read in one of the biographies, that he would come home when they lived in Springfield, he would come home from the law practice, bring the cow home from the community grazing space in the middle of Springfield, put on a blue apron and help Mary cook. So there's all of that. Food was kind of a touchstone that Mary used to kind of bring him forward in the White House when he was so beleaguered by the people who came asking him for favors, and of course the terrible decisions he needed to make on a daily basis. So she would invite old friends to come by for breakfast, and he typically was at his desk early, and then she would go in and say, well, you have to come in, so-and-so is here, he's from Springfield, you have to come in and you have to eat. They would have other people over. He would sit at it, you know, and again, this kind of social construct that he would act as host. And, you know, family style serving of, you know, there's one woman who wrote about how she had been a child and they sat at the big table and he, you know, just like, I think as I'm remembering right, she's just sort of like a farmer would scoop into the bowl and, you know, put it in on the plate, serving it up. But I think, you know, we were talking about the storytelling power. I think one of the most evocative images is one that I came to at the Lincoln Cottage, where oftentimes Mary wasn't there. She was off with Robert in New England. So the president and Tad, the youngest boy, were there. And, you know, Tad would have been 10-ish, you know, in 1862, 1863, 10 or 11. And he had a uniform, you know, he was very much a young soldier. I think the soldiers sort of spoiled him. And he and his father would go down and eat supper with the troops who were camped on the grounds of the cottage. And I mean, can you imagine any other president doing that? I mean, of course, Lincoln had been a soldier. And so he was more familiar with that than some of the other men who have served. Although we do have other soldiers, of course, you know, Eisenhower.
Yeah, Eisenhower and Grant, yeah.
But that his connection with the everyday soldiers seemed to, the way I interpreted that moment, to be particularly evocative, and it's food that connects us to that. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does, because I think it's, you know, I mean, you're talking about in a lot of ways how not only does food connect us, but the different connections that it creates with different people and different groups of people and different communities of people. You know, Abraham and Mary Lincoln were both born in Kentucky, but into very different types of households. And while they did come together, they came from different food traditions and tastes to a large extent. And that's, you know, we think of that in the field when we're thinking of archaeology and what the archaeology tells us and what you might find at a, you know, on a log cabin on the frontier versus, you know, a more established household that has more means or something like that. What evidence did you find about how their environments and their interactions with other cultures and traditions and resources, you know, I guess what I'm asking is, tell us how Mary Lincoln's tastes differed from her husband's and how those two tastes merged in their household.
I love Mary Lincoln. I tend to look at her as, this may be, it is contrarian, as a balanced person. You know, by the, you know, we read so much about her at the end of her life, when the poor woman had lost 2 children, her husband, and had been beaten up by the press continually. But she was whip smart, I think, and generous to others. But she also was, I guess, for lack of a better word, spunky. She had lost her mother as Abraham had lost his. Her father remarried as Thomas Lincoln did. Her stepmother sat down and had 8 more children. So poor Mary and her sisters got lost in the shuffle. And Elizabeth, Mary's oldest sister, kind of took over, watching over for her, although she went to a French focused school in Lexington, sort of as she would, it was boarding school, but she'd come home weekends, is kind of how I understand it. There were servants, slaves in the Todd household, Mary's father's household. There's one story where Mary ran away. She got on her horse and she rode to Senator Clay's house because she thought that the cook was going to really scold her because she had put, as a prank, had put salt in the woman's coffee.
Oh no.
Yeah. So, you know, as a child being a prankster. But, you know, this is a community. Lexington is a community that has fine restaurants. There was a French restaurant, a French bakery, fine, you know, fine cuisine, fine ingredients, you know, being right on the river, they could get a lot from all over. My sense of it is that, and when you look at how she deals with food in later life, you know, she knows what's what about, you know, and her family entertained because her father was politically important. Her older sister, Elizabeth, was the first to go to Springfield. And she went because she fell in love at college with Ninian Edwards' son. And so the two of them go off and become a power couple in Springfield. they live on a house up on the hill. They do fine entertaining. The next sister comes and she marries a physician. That's Frances. She marries William Wallace. And then Mary comes along. And the stories that you read about the one dish that the books all talk about Mary cooking is this almond cake, which there's a recipe that is allegedly handed down through Mary's nieces. And it's a very fancy sponge cake kind of a thing, sort of like an angel food, not really too spongy, but more angel foody with almonds in it. And in Mary's day, it took 2 days to make because you had to deal with getting the almonds pulverized and blanched and pounded. And so it was quite a deal to make. But the other thing about Mary, and it gets to your point, Erin, about how their lives connected. You know, as Mary looked after Abraham in the White House, making sure that he would come out and eat. There's a story where at one point she says to the cook, "Do you know how to make an old-fashioned chicken fricassee?" Which is a chicken in a white cream gravy kind of a deal, because it's his favorite and he's not eating and we need to get him to eat. So she knew that she could tempt his appetite and help promote his health by this meal, but she also knew enough to promote his career in Springfield. She'd been raised in a political family. She knew how politics worked. Her father was active. You know, as I said, she went off riding off to Senator Clay's house. She was smart. She was bold. I don't think she brooked a lot of nonsense. She was kind to people, but I think she paid attention to what was going on. And so they entertained regularly in Springfield. And what I kind of pieced together, there are a couple of years where you had the complete grocery ledger. So, you know, you get clues there about what she cooked. I know the cookbook that she had, which was one of Miss Leslie's cookbooks. Miss Leslie is sort of the Martha Stewart of the middle 19th century. And so I have, by luck, the same edition that Mary had.
Oh my goodness.
I found it at a used bookstore and bought it. And before I started doing this work, and when I started doing the work and I opened it up, I thought, well, by golly, meant to be. So you have that world of recipes, and there's a chicken fricassee in there, and an almond pound cake, which is similar but not quite the same. But you look at what was in the grocery ledgers, compare and have the resource of the recipes that she could have used. And you see that, and then there are others who, very few, who wrote, well, we went to Lincoln's and we had, and he goes, yes, yes, but why aren't there more of you? You know, they went and had at one point strawberry ice cream and in high strawberry season in June. And there in the grocery ledger, there is ice, cream, and strawberries practically in a row. So you know, that's like a eureka moment. So you see her and entertaining friends, you know, women who come over, arranging meals with politically placed people. So I think using food this way to draw out Lincoln a little bit, to encourage him to be perhaps not so much stuck with his nose in a book, lying down on the living room floor reading, which he liked to do. But the food instance with Mary that was one of these eye-opening moments for me was one of the children had a memory that Mary Lincoln made donuts and cookies for the kids. So this is not something you think of Mary Lincoln in her fancy dresses, you know, at the White House. You know, this is a woman who did sew. She sewed all her fancy clothes in Springfield. They were not all that well off. They did okay, but they weren't, the richest family in town. That may have been her sister. But, there were 3 boys, Robert, Willie, and Tad. There was the dog Fido. Have you ever seen a picture of this dog, Fido?
Yes.
This dog is
A classic looking dog.
classy looking dog,
Yeah.
classy looking mongrel dog.
Yeah. No.
And it looks like it's a pretty big dog, like a, I don't know, like a golden retriever size, but smooth coated more than so. And if you look at the Springfield house, the windows go up, from the floor, and there's the back door into the kitchen. So, I mean, I can just see these boys, running around the dining room, going out the windows, picking up donuts on their way. This was a loving mother who cared about these children in a playful way, I think. She also, again, to just kind of talk about her dedication to caring about cooking, they had purchased this stove, which is a Royal Oak 8, I think, or 9, I forgot now the number. This stove is a wonder. She wanted to take it to the White House, not realizing that she wouldn't be cooking in the White House, that they had staff to do that. Susan Hake, who is the director of the Lincoln house in Springfield when I was doing the work, was very kind to help me understand how this stove works. The thing is amazing. It has a relatively small firebox. And you see how it can bake flat sheets of things, how it can roast things, how you can put stuff on top. It's just a model of efficiency, and I really wanted to cook on it, but of course, you can't do that. So, it's that was again part of what I learned was the technology of cooking. What we from our vantage point think of is, oh well, they're all just so backward. They have cast iron stoves, and well, that's not true.
Yeah.
Yes, they had cast iron stoves, but they're wonderful. Yes, they didn't have refrigerators, but they had kind of a cold room on the side of adjacent to the kitchen, where she could keep all kinds of foodstuffs safely.
Rae, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because actually one of the questions that already came in from the audience is about that very thing. It's how did they keep food cold? Sort of what were the mechanisms and maybe seasonality of how they did that too?
Yeah, again, it's kind of hard to know specifically because we don't have a lot of information. But as I said, they bought ice from the ice manufacturer in town. Was a small room that didn't have windows in it, as I recall. And it's like, a big old-fashioned pantry. If anybody lives in a big old-fashioned Victorian house, like my grandmother's house, there was a whole room. There was a pantry that had places where you could put 50-pound bags of flour and 50-pound bags of cornmeal, and shelves for things. They did milk the cow, so there were shelves for buckets or flat saucers, because it's only one cow, to let the cream rise so you could churn butter. Whether she actually churned butter or not, I'm unsure. I don't know, as the house has made a determination on that as to whether she actually would have done it. But you certainly, can separate the milk and have cream for fancy uses and regular old milk for, whatever else you want. A wide variety of dried goods, of course. When you look at the things that are written in cookbooks from the 1850s and 60s, you see them talking about, just the common sense things we do to keep things cool. You know, keep it in the shade, use, you know, various kinds of insulation, you know, around them, that sort of thing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
I think?
yeah, that does. It was also President Lincoln who fixed a national day of Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday of November. It was as much to acknowledge the quote, something like the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies, as it was to acknowledge the tremendous loss and suffering and his resolve to restore peace and harmony and tranquility and union in this country. So it's, you know, it's much more complex as a holiday than we might think of when I mean, it's still complicated to get everyone together and celebrate a big meal. But it was very much when in this proclamation where Lincoln's declaring it, as much about being grateful and thankful for what, for the goodness and the bounty, as it was about acknowledging the loss that was happening at the time. And one of the recipes in your book is for cranberry sauce, which shows up repeatedly in Thanksgiving Day menus in the United States. I believe cranberry sauce is associated specifically with English colonial settler foodways and first comes into cookbooks in this country in that tradition. Narragansetts had a very different use for cranberries. So I think of cranberry sauce as one of those instances where European settlers are taking an indigenous ingredient and turning it into, using it in a European context. You have generously agreed to share that recipe from your book, so I will pull that up now. Give me a second here just to do this.
There it is.
So hopefully folks can all see this now. This is the 1845 cranberry sauce recipe from Rae's book. It's one of 55 recipes that appear in the book. And Rae, can you tell us a little bit about this recipe and how it reflects Lincoln and Abraham and Mary Lincoln's experience and how it connects to them?
It's a totally fabulous cranberry sauce recipe. I mean, bar none. It's the only one I do. This is one where I don't have a really clear linkage to the Lincolns, except to know that in Springfield, when they lived there, the newspapers were chock full of ads, seasonal ads for cranberries. Here, now, cranberries, exclamation point. And it's, you know, again, as you're saying, it's sort of the touchstone holiday. The editor of Godey's Lady's book, Sarah Hale, had tried for years to get a national day of Thanksgiving. She kept pleading, you know, editorializing that we needed one. And so she kind of gives herself credit and maybe deserves some of it for the celebratory part of it, because you do see that period of giving Thanksgiving through fasting and a day of being mindful of, you know, losses and sacrifice is part of that tradition too. And that Lincoln combined the two is sort of a wonderful thing. So the recipe itself, this is one where I don't have a good clear line. You know, I don't have in the store logs that she bought cranberries, but I just know that, you know, it's the kind of thing she would have done, and it's really, really good. And what I really like about it, and this is one of those things about, you know, the things you discover in old recipes, is it's not real sweet, as you can see. It's just, you know, a half cup of brown sugar, and you have to watch it so it doesn't scorch, but it cooks up really thick. And it's not thick because it has, you know, extra pectin or anything in it. It's just, you know, the goodness of the berry that's there. And so you can sort of mound it up nicely in a dish. And
do you want me to turn to that so folks can see?
sure, if you think people have had a chance to.
There you go.
Go.
So as you can all see here, exactly what Rae's talking about. This is standing, this is mounding nicely here on this bowl. You can tell how thick it is.
Yeah, and there's, you know, there's no pectin or anything in it. That's just cranberries and just that little bit of sugar and just the teensiest little bit of water to keep it from sticking to the bottom of the pot. And it keeps, easily for a week or two in the fridge.
That's fantastic.
Really
So
good.
if any of you are looking for, I always like doing some sort of, maybe traditional sauce or relish. And then every year I try to throw in something else that's different or new or something else to try. So if any of you are looking for either a twist on your favorite cranberry sauce or a new thing, I hope you try this and you can let everyone know that it's an offering from Lincoln's Life and Times here too. Another recipe, so we have 2 recipes that we're sharing this evening with you all in full. And the second one is Abe Lincoln's Gingerbread Men. And I think of, this one, unlike cranberry sauce, which is taking an ingredient indigenous to these lands, Gingerbread Men, I really think of that as being purely European tradition that's being transplanted here. And I couldn't, I associate it with Swedish gingerbread cookies or, certainly the Germans have their own, gingerbread or biscuits or cookies, but gingerbread men, I think, date back to Elizabethan times in England as a tradition. But tell us a little bit more about this specific recipe and what you learned about gingerbread men in Lincoln's Life and Time.
This recipe is actually pretty much from Lincoln himself, in a way. I'm sure, you all know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Lincoln is telling the story about how he doesn't feel appreciated by Douglas. That Douglas is sort of slamming him all the time and not appreciating what he is. And he said it reminds him, as he slides into this anecdote from the way he did, of a boy from his childhood who liked gingerbread men more than anybody else. And the boy would come up and when Lincoln had gingerbread men and say, hey, give me a man. And Lincoln probably did. And he said, nobody likes gingerbread men more than I do, this other boy did. And I never get any. So Lincoln describes that his mother would get some sorghum and she would get some ginger and she would make these men. So there are the 2 key differentiating ingredients: sorghum as opposed to molasses, which is a similar sweet syrup. If you're not familiar with it, I think it's lighter. It's more, I don't know what you say, or more buttery in a way.
That's fair. Yeah.
And maybe kind of a cross between mild molasses and honey, sort of. I mean, it's sorghum is what it is. And you can find it in grocery stores, in big grocery stores, sort of in the molasses section, or you can get it mail order. But so I started, again, looking for recipes that would get me those ingredients in a gingerbread man, and I found this one, and it's a perfect recipe for kids to make. It's because what you're making is a dough that has the texture of like kids' play clay, and you end up, mixing it. I end up sort of, finishing the mixing by hand, kneading in the last of the flour, and then, rolling it out on a counter into a snake-like thing, and then, folding in half. If everybody has a chance to read the directions here. So you sort of, roll it into a snake about 1 foot long and maybe 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick. It can be whatever you want it to be. And then you sort of fold it in half.
Oh, well, we have pictures of that.
Yes.
Yep.
And then you twist the neck and stick the arms underneath, which is, part of your snake there. So they last for a long time, put up in a sealed container. They're sturdy enough that you can put them in your pocket and they won't break up too much. Well, it might lose an arm, in which case you have to eat that first, sort of like the ears on the Easter Bunny chocolates. But it's a really nice, not too sweet treat. And that, Lincoln practically gave us the recipe because he gave us the 2 key ingredients.
Yeah.
Is really special, I think.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to find one that works pretty well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. How often do you make these, Rae? Because just so everyone here knows, she actually whipped these up yesterday to give me these pictures so that we could show you the sort of, visually show you the steps of the different parts and the twist and the arm here. Do you make these that frequently yourself?
Well, the problem with making them is that then you need to eat them. And even though they keep, they're really nice dunked in coffee. Easily, 4 or 5 times a year, around the holidays for sure. It's just a nice thing to have around.
Yeah.
And the grandkids don't live near us. So, that would be helpful if they did, because then I could get them to do the rolling, twisting, sticking arms on the back and helping eat.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and thank you again, Rae, for providing those, and we can send those out to afterwards.
Sure.
Because I know that I didn't have those on the screen there very long. And thanks again for generously allowing us to share those on screen so that folks could get a sense of the kinds of recipes also that are in your book, because there are so many of them. I think for a staff party one time there was like a rhubarb shrub or something, I think in there that we made for a staff party one time, a non-alcoholic.
Yeah, that's a really nice drink. Rhubarb back then was considered a tonic, a spring tonic, and it didn't make its way into rhubarb tarts for a while. So
that's what it was called. It's a rhubarb tonic, not a shrub. Yeah.
Well, but it's the same. You're right. It's the same group of things. There are vegetables and meats and breads. There's a to die for biscuit. I had never realized, and this is sort of a realization from the food to me, not so much Lincoln-ness, but you keep reading about how these soldiers could survive on a biscuit. You think, pop and fresh, really? Huh? No, tasty as those things are, they're all air. This sour milk biscuit is chewy and dense, but in a good way. It's the only biscuit I ever make.
Really?
Unless I'm testing other recipes. And it is what someone could survive on very easily. Because the dough is dense enough, you can wrap it around a ramrod and toast it over a campfire, and it's really fine, truly fine.
That's really interesting too, that in doing your research and finding these things that were popular at different points and places in history, that it sounds like some of these have really become go-to recipes for you.
Absolutely. And when I've got my go-to Lincoln recipes, there are 55 in the book. There are at least 10 or 12 I make all the time. When I did the research then following this book into Benjamin Franklin, I have my Franklin recipes that I use all the time too. It's an opportunity to, I guess in a way, refresh my mental thinking about food, to step back and say, let's try this, let's have this. And it's an extension of what I did when I first started the work, which was, that one's good, that one's good, that one's good. And poor John would come home and there would be, a century of food on the dining room table.
It'd be nice to be around when you're doing that kind of exploration and testing all those things at once. That'd be a fun experience too.
It is fun.
Yeah. You mentioned Ben Franklin, and you have studied other notable figures in history, and your most recent book is on Ben Franklin. They are clearly separated by time and distance, but were there any notable similarities or differences that really stuck out to you between Franklin and Lincoln as far as food habits go?
Well, Franklin cooked too. He liked his cereals. He was a firm believer in the importance of cornmeal from a philosophical point of view. And like Lincoln, he wrote about the force of American agriculture and the importance of American agriculture. Franklin is sitting there looking at the vastness of the country beyond the Allegheny Mountains and realizing what a tremendous resource this is for the people in Europe, where everybody's all crowded together. There is no room to breathe or establish your own business, was his thinking. Come here, we have room for you. We value people who are wanting to make their own way, who are willing to work hard, who are willing to educate themselves and their family and do good things. And part of the key to that was, agriculture and the agricultural strengths of the American nation to be. And then, here's Lincoln, living on the edges of that frontier, in Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois. So it's an interesting connection between the two of them.
Yeah. Another thing separated by time and geography again, but you wrote a book on World War I food conservation, right?
I did.
And food production had obviously, like the agricultural production, and also how people cooked changed quite a bit in that time. And the war was, of course, not on US soil. But what similarities and differences did you notice between when you were studying and researching foodways during the Civil War for Abraham Lincoln and World War I, food conservation? I mean, even thinking in terms of, rationing and other things like that. And what did you notice any similarities there too?
That's a really good question. And I must confess, it's not one that I've really considered significantly. But at the top of my head, once again, the hero is corn.
Yep.
That during World War I, they had to change foodways so quickly. There wasn't time to set up a structure for rationing the way there was in World War II with rationing coupons and whatnot. I mean, our participation in the war was essentially a year. So it was really fast. And so Herbert Hoover, who became the food administrator, said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get everybody to sign a pledge. Everybody's going to voluntarily do what they can. The pledge was genius. It was, I will pledge to do what I can to help the food administration. It wasn't, but then there were stipulations that they wanted people to adhere to. And one of the primary ones was eliminating wheat, because as they said, let's face it, we have to share with our allies in France and Europe. And those sissy Frenchmen can't handle stout corn grain. They have to have wheat. So we have to share our wheat with them because, heaven help them, they can't eat corn as cornmeal. Well, I mean, the story is clearly more complex than that. I mean, wheat ships, corn doesn't. Corn is subject to spoilage more easily than wheat is. But it was a nice public relations spin to encourage people to do that. And there were limits on wheat and fat, wheat, meat, fat, sugar. And at the height of the food restrictions, the voluntary food restrictions in January and February of 1918, of the regular 27 meals that people ate during the week, only 3 were unrestricted. The others were wheatless or meatless or wheatless and meatless. So you see people using a lot of vegetables as substitutes. The potato was raised to historic patriotic status. There were store windows where people would have like baking potatoes put in uniforms that they would make little, little uniforms. Every spud a soldier would be the over the display of these little soldier potatoes marching. So that, it was a big concentrated thing. And it was a way to, bring the nation together in this collective enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have another question from the audience, and it's asking about whether the Lincolns had a butcher or a grocery store, or where they did. You mentioned the food shopping. Where were they doing that food shopping? If my memory is correct too, there were fruit sellers that Mary Lincoln would frequent, and that was some of their interaction with immigrant communities and populations in Springfield as well. But what can you tell us about where they were doing their shopping?
Well, Mary's younger sister, Anne, married Mr. Smith, who ran a grocery store. So there you go. And as my understanding is, at the time, there were 2 or 3 other grocery stores. There were bakeries. There are stories of, Abe walking down the street with Tad on his shoulder and Willie by his side going into the bakery to get, breakfast breads and bringing them home. There were like farmers markets in the summer where people would, farmers would bring in their produce. So Springfield was a pretty sophisticated community and well supplied with a variety of foodstuffs. And, there were restaurants and taverns too. There's a sense, and I'm not coming up with a footnoted stipulation, only just kind of a recollection. There was sort of takeout but don't hold me to that, because as I'm saying it, I think I've had it. It wasn't something I covered in the book because I was focusing more on home meals. But and Lincoln, when he was on the road, certainly ate out a lot. But you see in the grocery store advertisements, around this time of year, the oysters begin to come in from the East Coast.
Yeah.
And there are, you'd really love to have been in Springfield, because there are all these ads for live oysters. And as I understand it, they put them in barrels with a bunch of seaweed, and it's wet. And that keeps them alive as they either come on the railroad from Baltimore or New York.
Yeah.
Or they come around and up the Mississippi. It's one of 2 paths, but you see them, the ads begin in late November, early December, oysters, now. And then as the weeks go by and, you keep reading the microfilms, they start getting cheaper.
Oh.
Hurry now. So that there's a whole story there in and of itself. But it's, you see a lot of foodstuffs advertised in the newspapers, and that was a really wonderful resource to begin to sense what was going on.
Yeah. Rae, one last question, and then I'll turn it back over to Phyllis to wrap us up for this evening.
Oh, no.
I know, we're already at the end of the hour. Your book includes a recipe for Lincoln cake, but this is not a cake Lincoln knew and loved. Can you tell us about the 1865 phenomenon of the Lincoln cake?
Well, this is part and parcel of, as I mentioned, the Dixie cookbook, where we had the Tilden cake. There were cakes named for famous people. And, there's George Washington cakes, there's Robert E. Lee cakes, and there's this Lincoln cake, which is developed by a number of people, because I have seen several recipes for it, and it's a mighty tasty cake. It makes a big angel food cake pan full, and it's got dried fruits in it, citron, as I remember. And it was just a cake to, honor him. And it was part of the social construct of American entertaining, or American life, that people would make these cakes in honor of a wide variety of famous personages.
Yeah. And all of these recipes, I remember in your book something about how in the weeks and months after Lincoln's assassination, a lot of these are getting published. And so it's honoring, but then also in the aftermath of, it's honoring and mourning in a way, which is really interesting, that it's, if you're going to be celebrating the life of this person, here is the cake in his honor.
At that moment.
Yeah.
When the nation was in a paroxysm of grief.
Yeah.
And temper that grief with a little bit of sweetness.
And I remember, I think in your book, you say a thin slice is really all you need. It's a
very thin slice. Yes, the angel food cake pan is enough to feed 20.
Yeah, my goodness.
But it's a good keeper, so you could have it out in a cake dish, fancy cake plate with cover on it. If you had to come by, at 10 and in the morning, after breakfast, and, maybe at 2 in the afternoon, if you just sort of needed to make sure it was still good to eat, just a little more off, it's got fruit in it, it's good for you.
That's a good point too, because, and that goes back to one of the audience questions about refrigeration. Sometimes recipes like that, you called it a good keeper. They were almost designed to keep for several days out, covered, but to be kept out on the counter, and that they might even improve.
Or wrapped in a thin cloth that's soaked in some sort of brandy or liquor that like a fruit cake. Which I happen to love. I don't think I've ever, I have met a few fruit cakes I don't like, but not the Lincoln cake. Not the Lincoln cake. It's lovely. Really. So
that's another thing that folks can make maybe in February for Lincoln's birthday. You could try making the Lincoln cake. So we've got a lot of different holidays and dates covered. Rae, thank you so much. This was so much fun to have you with us tonight. And thanks to everyone else for joining in. And Phyllis, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, Rae, Erin, thank you both so much. This was a wonderful conversation and some amazing recipe ideas as well. I know I'm probably not alone when I say that food comes along with the holidays, and I always find my favorite ones that are out there, and this has just given me some great ideas for the upcoming holiday season. So if you were not able to get your question answered tonight, then please feel free to email me. I did put my email address in the chat box, so you can email me. It's at pevans@alplm.org, and I'll be happy to pass along those questions to Miss Eighmey on your behalf. If you're not able to jot down the recipes as they were presented on the screen, then let me know and we'll try to get those out to you as well. Next up, we have a high-powered interview with authors Ron White and Talmadge Boston on Tuesday, November 30th at 7 p.m. If you haven't already registered, then be sure to visit our website at alplm.org and sign up today. And check back often, because we're just beginning to fill up our 2022 events calendar. So make sure you check it out and see if we've added anything. As we close out tonight's webinar, you will see a short survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey, as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you would like to see in the future. Maybe in 2022, we can add one of those in. As always, we want to thank each of you for joining us this evening. We are excited to continue with our online programming and look forward to seeing you all on November 30th. This concludes tonight's program, so please take care, stay warm, and good night.
Night.